Good afternoon and welcome to this evening conversation with Barry O'Farrell, the High Commissioner designate to India. He was announced as Australia's top diplomat to this country in February 2020. He has begun his tenure here in rather interesting times. He has served in the Parliament of New South Wales between 1995 to 2015, so he's a seasoned politician. And of course, he's also been the Premier of the state between 2011 and 2014. He's no stranger to India. High Commissioner O'Farrell has led a number of delegations to build business relationships between India and Australia, especially the Indian states. And of course, he has intimate knowledge of this country as he serves as the Deputy Chair of the Australia-India Council Board. We are delighted to have you with us, High Commissioner.
Thank you, Samir. It's not just a pleasure, but it's a privilege to be a part of one of these ORF forums.
Now, thank you very much. Now, before I begin an interesting conversation, interesting on my end, because I have some difficult questions for you, let me also make some housekeeping announcements. Let me welcome our viewers on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Those of you who may have questions for the High Commissioner, please post them on the mediums you are viewing this broadcast on. Our team will get them to me. I will name you and I will pose the question to the High Commissioner, especially if they are spicy. So sharp questions, and I get to pose them to the High Commissioner on your behalf. High Commissioner, let me start quickly with the bilateral first. We hear about India's first digital bilateral summit on the anvil, and it happens to be with the Australians. What is cooking here? Is that happening? How different is a digital summit? Does Australia have experience in doing this?
Samir, regrettably, as you know, the January summit between the two leaders, which was to coincide with Raisina, was deferred because of the bushfires in Australia. The rescheduled version of that has been put off by the current COVID crisis affecting the world. But like good friends, Australia and India have stayed in contact throughout this crisis. And in a telephone conversation earlier last month, both Prime Ministers agreed to hold a virtual leaders summit later this month, towards the end of this month, and that is going ahead. And it'll be the second virtual leaders summit we've had. We had one earlier, but this will certainly be our most significant. But you know, as we've all discovered in the time of COVID, the era of Zoom and WebEx and other technologies are bringing us together closer and more often than ever before. And I think it is quite innovative. I think it will be groundbreaking, and I think you should all just keep an eye on what's going to happen.
So what are the areas you think are most important for the two leaders at this time? Of course, the pandemic is going to be a centerpiece of the conversations, but in your estimation, what would the two leaders be talking about?
Well, you're absolutely right, Samir, because both leaders did, when they spoke in early April, talk about sharing, as many countries are, experiences in battling the COVID disease. So that will be part of it. But principally, there are three issues that we're seeking to take out. That is a further elevation of the relationship. Secondly, committing to greater cooperation in the post-COVID world, particularly in that Indo-Pacific that we share. And above all, realising the great ambition, if you like, of the Australia-India relationship, which is delivering security and stability to the Indo-Pacific.
I'll come back to this question a bit later, High Commissioner. Let me cut to the chase and come straight to the point. Australia has consistently called for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. This has been something that we hear consistently from Canberra. Are you concerned about China's reluctance to allow this inquiry to proceed? Are you also worried that we have seen muscularity in the Chinese behavior towards Australia post this announcement? How is Australia responding to this new political position that China seems to be taking on this very important question of an inquiry?
Samir, as my government has said, an international independent review at the right time into the origin and the spread of the pandemic of this scale is absolutely necessary and sensible. and we've had significant expressions of support internationally for that idea. The purpose of the review isn't to target a country or an institution. We simply want to learn the lessons and make sure that we're better prepared next time. And regrettably, as this country, India, knows, there will be another pandemic. On the issue of economic coercion, I've made it clear, even as a relatively new diplomat, that is absolutely unacceptable. And I hope it's not what China is trying to do. My Prime Minister, my Trade Minister have expressed Australia's view that China understands it gets a mutual benefit from our trading relationship and wouldn't do anything to trash its international reputation as a reliable trading partner by resorting to economic coercion.
High Commissioner, you've been a premier of a very important state in Australia. Do you think there is across the board political support for what is a clearly unique and strong Australian position? Do you believe there is a bipartisan, multi-party backing your government enjoys in the position that you're taking?
Well, Samir, I can tell you that China has achieved one great infrequent first in my country, which, like India, is a vibrant democracy, like India where parties battle it out not only in the lead up to elections, but often in between elections. The recent Chinese statements, some of their actions, have united the federal leadership across the parties in Australia. And that's a positive, because the position that Prime Minister Morrison, Trade Minister Birmingham and Foreign Minister Payne are putting forward is supported by their opposite numbers. And that means Australia has a very strong position when it comes to trade matters, which is that, you know, we are a historic trading nation. We've been doing it for more than 200 years. But just because we trade with you doesn't give you an entitlement to dictate how we run our country.
Let me come to another institution of the country. So we've spoken about the politicians. Let's talk about the media. We have seen in the past few years now, the Chinese have been buying a lot of editorial space. They have been influencing media narratives around the world. We've seen that happening in our country. And before I proceed with the question, let me a quick call out to shout out to the Sunday Telegraph. I think the Indian media needs to be given what they are having. I have just loved the way he has taken on the Communist Party and rebuffed many of their muscular propositions. So how is the media debate in Australia unfolding on this issue? The public opinion, the mass opinion, beyond politics, on the streets, how are they responding to this Chinese coercion?
Well, Samir, you're more expert with India media than I am, but I do think that both of our countries share the same sort of liberal values, and one of them is a free, open free and open media sector that expresses a variety of views. And clearly, Mick Carroll at the Sunday Telegraph will be delighted with the endorsement of the ORF for his sales across New South Wales. But you know, our media tends to be strong and forthright. And I've noticed since I've been here, in a country in which there's far more newspapers than in Australia, but there's no shortage of opinions being expressed, opinions that take different views on every issue. So yes, Australia, like India, has a critical media. Yes, Australia, like India, has a media that holds government to account. And yes, Australia, like India, has a media that is often quicker than governments to pick up what they perceive to be threats from outside to national sovereignty and other issues. And you know, I see India recently changed its foreign direct investment laws in terms of companies. We did that a number of years ago when the current Prime Minister of Australia was Treasurer of Australia, when a similar country bought a number of major assets in Australia. So these are features that we share in common. They're features that I think, again, demonstrate the great depth of similarities between our two countries and give me great heart for what the future of that relationship will be.
And finally, on the Australian universities, that's another debate that we've seen come to the fore. The endowments, the money that comes in through Chinese students, the sponsorships, and in some sense, the creeping capture of the university system. How is that being responded to? Are you worried about that? Do you think you need to get a little more Indians into your universities now? Is that an incentive to get some more of us there?
Well, absolutely. And so Australia has made it clear for more than a decade that we're happy to invite, in fact, long more than a decade, because we're doing it through the Colombo Plan, the original Colombo Plan. But we're delighted to receive students from around the world to come and study in Australia. We think that the quality of our education is good. We know that it comes at a cheaper price than some of the major competitors we face, and we're happy to continue to promote that. But ultimately, governments can't dictate where students come from. That'll be decided by families and students themselves. But we'll continue to market Australia's educational services here in India, because we think that's another way in which we can deepen and strengthen the relationship. I think the best thing going forward for the Australia-India relationship is the fact that, you know, around 700,000 Indians have become residents of Australia. That gives us innately, across our suburbs, across our cities, across our small towns, a better understanding of India, Indians, and the country from which they come. And so education adds an extra layer to that. And whilst COVID has caused disruptions, whilst COVID has seen online courses in some instances take the place of face-to-face courses, I think we will get through this. And I think that Australia has an opportunity to grow even further the proportion of students coming to its universities from India.
High Commissioner, we have close to 200 viewers at this moment, and I already have, I think, 10 to 12 queries from those who are watching you. So I want to, in a sense, hasten my conversation with you so that I can allow these questions to come to you. So I'm going to ask you just 2 or 3 more questions. The first, of course, is what are we really defending here, High Commissioner? You talk about the free media, you talk about democracies, you talk about transparency and accountability through the investigation. To what purpose? I think the liberal order has failed completely. And the WHO, in some ways, is a manifestation of the failure of multilateral institutions and the multilateral order that we built together in the previous century. What are we trying to save here? What does the failure of the WHO represent, and can it be retrieved?
So let me take it from the Indian perspective, I suppose, Samir. You know, as the world's largest democracy, representing 1.3 billion citizens, it would be good for humanity for India to take a more significant role on the world stage. Australia's particularly been a strong supporter of India doing that. We've been a supporter for a long time of India assuming a rightful place, a permanent place on the United Nations Security Council. We do so because we have shared democratic values. We do so because we're both maritime powers in the Indo-Pacific, and we do so because we understand that organisations and institutions like the World Health Organization are critically important to organisations, to countries in our regions. And so, you know, like India, we want the World Health Organization reformed and better resourced so that it's better equipped to combat the next disease. So I think the Australia-India relationship is at an all-time high in a world where international institutions are under threat, where reform and renovation is required, as the Prime Minister said during last week's Non-Aligned Movement Summit. He said 2 things that struck home to me and really struck a chord for me. I said before that I think it'd be good for humanity for India to take an even larger place on the world stage. Why? Well, because one of the things that Prime Minister Modi said at that summit was that the World Health Organization and the international community needed to boost the health capacity building across developing countries. Now, I might have missed it, but I don't think any, if many, world leaders have stuck their head up in the middle of the crisis which every nation's going through with COVID and talked about the challenge the extra challenge it poses in developing countries. So that's the first example, I think, writ large, of the sort of humanity that India could bring to a new multilateral order. The second thing he said, of course, which goes to, I think, your question about multilateralism generally, is that international institutions needed to become more representative and more reflective of human welfare. And there is no doubt there is a challenge there to make those international institutions, to make our post-World War II international system fit for purpose again, so that whether it's a trade, political or health battle, we're best equipped to deal with the next one.
So let me ask you two easy questions after that rather complex one. One, India takes over the chair of the chairperson of the WHO. What do you expect from India in that role? And two, what do you do about your other good friend, the United States of America, and their decision not to fund the WHO? So how do these two actors in the WHO become important in the Australian analyses?
Well, I think the great benefit of India assuming leadership of the Executive Council of the World Health Organization is that as a country that not only has suffered too many pandemics itself, but as a country that in this pandemic has reached out to neighbouring countries to assist them in their efforts to battle this terrible disease, it understands the purpose of what the World Health Organization was set up for. It understands that unless we learn the lessons from this latest global pandemic and equip that organisation with the resources and the lessons needed to combat it better next time, we're simply going to spin our wheels, if you say. We're not going to progress. So I think one of the great things that I'd expect out of the Indian leadership of the World Health Organization is a greater understanding of the benefit of that organisation, which I have to say Australia has witnessed in its region too, particularly in the Pacific. And you know, we are a friend of the World Health Organization. We've seen its good work. We are committed to its funding. That's been reaffirmed recently. Now, that's not the view of everyone around the world, but I think what we need to do more than beat things up is to ensure that they are strengthened. And that's, of course, the message that Prime Minister Modi took to the G20 summit, where he talked about the World Health Organization needing strengthening. So we're happy to work on that agenda. My Prime Minister and the government are working on that agenda. We're getting some international support for that. Others will run their own agendas. The only agenda Australia has here is to try and ensure that an important international institution continues to remain relevant, continues to remain effective in combating health challenges across the world.
You know, President Trump has recently, his administration has laid emphasis on something they call the Economic Prosperity Network, building a whole new architecture, certainly in our region, the region Australia and India inhabit. How is this different to the BRI? Is it competing with the BRI? Is it different folks sitting on the high table deciding the future architecture of the region instead of the Chinese doing it? How is this network different and more plural?
Well, look, I think the terrific thing is that in addition to the cooperation that Australia and India and Japan and the United States have in relation to the quadrilateral, there's also been a broader group where there have been regular contact between our foreign secretaries and their equivalents in Japan, in New Zealand, in the United States, in Korea, and in Vietnam. And that's been around the way in which we've been responding to COVID and the way in which we can strengthen our supply chains. And you know, Samir, you will know because of your background and experience that never waste an opportunity in a crisis. And the fact is that supply chain resilience has long been a key issue for Australia and Japan, for that matter. And so part of the discussions that have been going on, because it's been sharpened by the pandemic, is the need for those of us with economic dependencies to look to diversify our economic relationships and to strengthen our supply chain. And I see India as having a real potential to become an alternative destination for global supply chains, with a young, tech-savvy population, India should be more integrated into the global value chain. And that's why, for instance, we've been such strong supporters and advocates for India signing up to RCEP, because we believe it's only through facing off against global competition that India can ensure it has the best industries in the world and be confident that it's in as attractive a place as possible in which to do business. You know, so whether it's the various forums discussing it or whatever, trusted partnerships are going to become increasingly important in a post-COVID world in ensuring that we have the sorts of efficient, reliable and resilient supply chains we need. And the more that countries can talk about that individually, collectively, and in groupings like ours, the better we're going to be off and the better the world's economy is going to be off.
High Commissioner, since you did mention supply chains and reorganizing and pluralizing dependencies, Australia has taken a rather strong and, again, an admirable position in some sense in terms of banning Chinese 5G networks. You know, for a country that was standing quite alone and was quite lonely as it stood against the BRI a few years ago, India was the only one outside the tent. Everyone seemed to be in the emperor's court. Do you believe Australia has enough support? Do you believe that your partners and allies are responding to your concerns and are beginning to understand the Australian analyses around this particular issue? Because if they don't, Australia banning 5G alone is not going to solve the problem of security. You're going to be still connected to partners who are riding on compromised networks. You'll have to unmute yourself, High Commissioner. Yeah.
So Samir, Rory Medcalf from the National Security College at my old university, the Australian National University, has recently published a book where he, in part, and Ambassador Suri commented on this recently, he in part points out that when one country takes a stand, others notice and it gives them heart and it strengthens their arm. And so, yes, Australia has banned high-risk vendors from our 5G network, but I think there are 2 points that need to be made. Firstly, as I hinted earlier, or maybe not hinted, but directly said earlier, sovereignty for us is absolutely essential. We see enormous economic opportunity in critical and emerging technologies, including 5G, the Internet of Things and quantum computing. And many of these technologies are going to become the backbones of our economies and our societies. So we're not comfortable with companies who manage those technologies being under the control of foreign countries. And the second point I'd make is values, and that values matter. We want to see new technologies that enable and empower individuals and businesses. We don't want to see them encroach on civil and personal liberties or enable authoritarianism. And for us, the future of global technology landscape and the norms and rules that will shape that landscape are going to be key to having ongoing vibrancy and openness of free societies like Australia and India. And that's why I think Australia and India really are natural partners in this area. India is set to become a data and technology superpower, if you like. Just look at Facebook's investments in Reliance Jio. These are harbingers of India's emerging influence in this space. And Australia is an open, technologically advanced nation who has few direct commercial interests at play, is a natural partner for shaping, with India, for shaping that emerging norm. And I think this is an exciting area for the bilateral relationship. But never overlook, Samir, whether in the playground with bullies or in trade and other areas, one person standing up can shape the influence and actions of others.
I agree with you, High Commissioner. I think more around the world need to stand up as well and be counted at this time. And that brings me to the final question from my end. And then I'm going to start asking you questions. I think we've got close to 40 odd queries from those who are watching this live cast. So my final question to you is that we have agreed that there is a need to reform multilateralism. There is a need to reform and radically strengthen global institutions. We spoke about the emerging and new supply chains and business and trade engagements. We spoke about a revitalization of some of the more traditional partnerships to respond to challenges. In your estimation, as someone who's been a political leader and now a diplomat, what is going to be the most significant impact of COVID-19 in the new world order, and what is the role for Australia and India to play in that new order?
So let me take that firstly at a regional level. Obviously, we see COVID and what we've been seeing going on within COVID as strengthening relationships in this region, strengthening the work we want to do in relation to the Indo-Pacific, because what we've seen through this crisis is like-minded countries, like-minded democracies reaching out to each other to assist. But clearly growth and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific are going to take a hit from this crisis. But so too, Samir, the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And I actually think you can argue that this virus is going to quicken the migration of wealth and power from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. Mm-hmm. Because we know what's happened to northern economies, and we know where the economies in this region are, including the projections for India and others. And I think that shift is only going to increase. So for Australia, we are only redoubling our commitment to building the kind of Indo-Pacific political and economic systems that favour openness, norms and rules, and not the so-called might is right politics. These are objectives that I know we share with India, and again, I think it's a reason why we're so deeply aligned on these strategic issues. I no longer think we have converged interests. I think through this process in recent years, because of the strength of the relationship, we have aligned interests, and certainly while I'm here, I'll be seeking to deepen them even further.
Hi, Commissioner. I'm going to now turn to the audience questions. We have lots of them, and I'm going to try and take as many of them as possible. Let me start with something which is interesting, at least for me, for someone who's grown up watching the Sunny Gavaskars at the MCG. The question is, what role do you see sports diplomacy playing with the Indian relationship? And do you see opportunities for the economic and social development of ties beyond business? This is from Brett Osler. Hello, Brett.
So I absolutely think that sports diplomacy will continue to be important. And I know, for instance, in lead up to the T20 Women's World Cup, there was a significant effort, including people in both places coming together. We had a function here at the High Commission around that sporting event. We know that one of the advantages that we perhaps have, again, with India, you can always strike up a conversation in this country, or equally a business conversation in Australia, by mentioning who your favourite Indian or Australian cricket player is, and everyone has an opinion because cricket still has that stamp. So it's an important door opener sometimes, and one of the challenges that we're currently facing is trying to ensure that the upcoming Test series that takes place in Australia, because that will be good not just for stadia and TV rights in Australia, but also for the incredibly vibrant TV networks back here, who must now be sick of seeing Michael Kasparovich continuing to roll up to bowl a Nova from 20 years ago.
No, I think if you can keep your fast bowlers away from us, that would be good social distancing. So
if you keep Virat Kohli away from our bowlers.
Okay, so we have another interesting question, and it's something that we spoke about, but this is more direct and more focused. So let me put this to you. This is from Narayan Kannan. He says, have you been talking to India to support you in your investigation, independent investigation into the pandemic? Have you spoken to the Indians? Have they responded to you? What has been the nature of conversation?
Well, not the role of ambassadors to reveal private conversations with heads of state, but there's no secret that that my Prime Minister is engaging with world leaders in relation to this matter. I also, without giving anything away, know for a fact, because it was publicly reported and publicly stated, that Prime Minister Modi said at the G20 summit that the World Health Organization required strengthening. Ultimately, that's what our goal is about.
Mm-hmm.
As I said before, it's not targeting a country or institution. It's doing what's prudent after any major event in business, in sport, in world politics, and that is trying to learn the lessons so that the vehicle that's responsible can be fit for purpose the next time it occurs.
We have a question from Natasha Jha Bhaskar, who works on the business side between the two countries. She says, she asks you, in fact, positive intent to engage with India has always existed, but what hasn't worked between the two countries? Or what needs to be done to strengthen the relationship? What needs to change in Australia? What needs to change in India for us to fully realize the potential?
So, my short answer to that is I think there needs to be more resilience on the Australian side and more Indian literacy. So the key, of course, because there are many opportunities here and we have some wonderful Australian success stories of dealing and partnering here in India. But sometimes people who think about diversifying their markets or think about other countries like India don't do the homework or come in and find it a bit harder than they think. Well, I learned a long time ago, even before I got into politics, Samir, that most things worth achieving in life take a lot of effort to achieve. And there's no difference in business. So I think on the Australian side, it is about literacy. It is about using partnerships in this country, using advisory firms, using Austrade and government services to have a better understanding of what's on offer, the way in which business operates, and then having a go. The second thing that I would say on the Indian side is as I noticed Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw has reiterated again today, is that there's a need in India not just for headline reform, but for fundamental reform to make it easier to do business. And we've seen some success in improving the ease of doing business in a number of Indian states. But it's fair to say that at a national level, there are some investors from Australia and elsewhere who find it incredibly difficult and can at times find the place uninviting. So we will do what we can to continue to promote the opportunities available to Australian business people and investors in India. We will continue to bring concerns to the attention of policymakers in India, where some of those people come back to us and say, look, we tried, but because of land laws or because of industrial laws or because of the way in which investment has to occur, we couldn't get past the second door. But as I say, no trade relationship in any country has ever been easy, not even in that country you were referring to earlier. But ultimately, you've got to adapt yourself to the circumstances, pick your marks well, and persevere.
Let me pose a question to you from one of your brethren, former Ambassador Ashok Sajjanar, Indian diplomat. He asks, why do you think China is behaving in such a belligerent and pugnacious manner? If it wants global leadership, it needs the support of other countries, not their antagonism. China's wolf warriors, on the other hand, have united much of the world against the country.
So look, I defer to the ambassador. I haven't even been able to present credentials yet because of the COVID crisis. So I'm only an ambassador designate. But I think the principle underneath it is right. And I think once again, can I make this point that India has carved out a role for itself in a variety of multilateral arrangements. As someone who joins, someone who works together in order to promote good outcomes. And clearly India has seen progress through that. Clearly countries who have worked with India through those processes, including Australia, have helped see progress. We've seen that cooperating together in delivering the right people into the right jobs in international institutions, which is incredibly important. Why you would seek to try and run in a global world as broad and as competitive as ours, a single agenda is beyond me. But I, as I say, in relation to the specific question I had earlier, I can't believe that any country, let alone China, which is the major trading partner of most countries around the world, I can't believe that it wants to risk its international reputation as a as a global trading partner by what have been characterised as threats of economic coercion.
Let me turn to another former ambassador, Ambassador Anil Tribunayat, and he asks you, how close is Australian position to the US objectives in the Indo-Pacific, and to what extent are you ready to go against China? Trump has claimed he might suspend bilateral ties with China.
Well, look, I'm not going to. I'm not going to speak for Australia in relation to President Trump, but I'll just make the obvious point, which is that every country that goes into a relationship, multilateral, bilateral, does so to advance its interests. And if by advancing its interests, it can mutually deliver the interests of others, and collectively they can deliver better outcomes, they will. And so, you know, Australia will run its own course. Australia will cooperate with India, with Japan, with the United States, where it believes it's in the interests of Australia. And it's not going to sign up to someone else's agenda because that person wants it, whether that person is China or the United States.
So I think you have now, between these two responses, also attended to the question asked by Ambassador Suresh Goyal. So I'm not going to repeat that question, which was very similar. There's a Indian viewer, Deepak Kumar. He says, my compliments to Australia for having very effectively limited the spread of COVID-19. What, in your opinion, are the highlights of the Australian strategy in controlling the pandemic?
Well, I think we were fortunate, firstly, in being an island continent, because probably the most important thing that Australia did on the 1st of February was to close its borders to anyone who had travelled to China, except for Australian citizens. So we immediately closed our borders, and that progressively increased to those other countries that where COVID outbreaks had occurred. So the first and foremost was to stop people coming into our country. Secondly, like India, it was about testing, it was about tracing, it was about ultimately imposing lockdowns on movement. And yes, we've had some success, but as the Prime Minister of Australia and the state premiers would tell you, that we cannot rest on our laurels because we're going through the same process many countries are, as to how do we relax these things and keep those levels low. I think the interesting thing, Samir, if I can just put this in, is that like India, Australia is a federation, albeit a federation with 6 states and 2 territories. You, of course, have 29 states and 7 territories. One of the things that the national government did in Australia very early, and it hasn't been done since the Second World War, and not even done in this way in the Second World War, is it formed a national cabinet, which comprised the Prime Minister and the chief ministers or premiers of each of the states, and they've been meeting regularly. They met again this morning in Australia to discuss issues informed by medical professionals and other experts, as they are in Australia, and then made national decisions which still had the capacity to have variations at a state level. So our Prime Minister announced a week ago a 3-stage relaxation process depending on further progress in the disease, but it's up to each of our states and territories as to how and when they institute that process. And so I think one of the things we've done well in Australia is use the federal process to get sensible outcomes, and to use the democratic process, as Prime Minister Modi has here, to convince citizens to abide by the restrictions imposed on them around restrictions on movement, social distancing and the like, that have been so critical in flattening the curves, not just in Australia but elsewhere.
Let me interject here, because I think you were going to a space which is actually a question asked by, I think, one of, if I recognize the name, he's one of our Ricina young fellows, Vincent Tarzia. He's a state parliamentarian from Australia, and he's been a young fellow with the ORF as well. And he asks you, High Commissioner, what do you think is the view of the world handling of COVID-19 crisis from an Indian perspective? Let me just flip this question, Vincent. Sorry, I'm going to turn your question around. What is your impressions of India's handling of the pandemic?
Samir, I know this won't necessarily have great resonance back home, but I think India's done an incredibly good job, because it took an early and tough decision in the world's second most populous country, but importantly, in a democracy, to convince people to stay in place. I sit here today on the 52nd or 53rd day of a national lockdown. India, like Australia, is a vibrant democracy. Indians, like Australians, first question when asked something by government is to say, why bother? And what we've seen in both of our countries is citizens overwhelmingly comply with a call for the national interest in combating this disease to do what they've been asked to do, which is stay indoors, stay socially distanced, isolate and protect those people who are most vulnerable. So I think the Indian performance has been good. During the initial part of the lockdown, the Indian government set about increasing the capability of its medical systems. It initially trebled the capacity for testing. It trebled the number of isolation wards and isolation beds available. It put industry, private and government industry to work in producing ventilators and the equipment needed. I simply make this point. Professor Shamika Ravi, one of your leading epidemiologists, who I think was
economist. I think we are all epidemiologists these days, but she's an economist, and she's doing a great job tracking the spread of infection and
she is. And whilst we're seeing a bit of an uptake at the moment, she made a point 2 weeks ago that early projections in February, when I arrived, said that this disease would affect 850,000. There'd be 850,000 cases by about now. Well, of course, today's figures suggest we have 10% of that. So I would simply say that whilst India is not out of the woods, India has put in an incredible effort. The amount of testing going on has increased almost tenfold. I think it's about 1,250 per million when it was less than 100 per million when the lockdown started. So I think Dr. Ravi's pronouncements demonstrate that India's done well, but like most countries, has to continue to do well.
My day begins with the reading Dr. Ravi's tweets. Every morning I look at her charts and graphs and decide whether I have to be a little optimistic or a little careful that day. I think she's doing a great service.
So Samir, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You're the local, and there's other locals listening. How do you think India's going?
No, I think considering our limited resources and of course our rather boisterous culture, I have been surprised both by the discipline that has been on display in India. And of course, I have also been pleasantly pleased with the level of cooperation between the states and the center. I think if we avoid the Twitter handles, the reality is that the states and center are doing a very good job at working together. Because we have such limited resources, we have to make most of what we have. So in my estimation, the two positives, I think the federal arrangement is working to its fullest, and individuals are displaying more discipline than I would have given them credit for had someone asked me this before the pandemic. So this is my assessment. I think the Indian story is still to be written. I think the next few weeks and the coming month is important. We can really come up with a unique and different response to this pandemic from other parts of the world if we continue to stay the course, if we continue to be disciplined, and if we continue to work together. I think this could be something that India at the end of 2 months would be pleased with. But like I said, our challenge lies ahead of us, not behind us. High Commissioner, let me ask you a question on trade. And I have this from Mahadevan Shankar, who's again part of the Business Council, and he poses a question to you. Will the signing of the LSA between both countries during the upcoming virtual meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison open up significant trade between both countries? And can we be ambitious to raise our bilaterals from 30 billion to 100 billion in the next decade?
We should have great ambition for this relationship. And I know that's a view expressed on the Indian side, and it's a view that Prime Minister Morrison shares. So, you know, the logistics supply agreement is important and will be an important brick in erecting that sort of architecture. But absolutely, we can proceed. But you know, if you want to talk about reciprocity in the relationship, and often I hear about reciprocity when I'm talking trade in India. And I did read your paper in April on free trade and RCEP, and I thought it made a couple of good points. It pointed out for me, who's married to a dairy farmer's daughter, that India is the biggest milk producer in the world. Australia does pretty well with milk too, but nowhere near as big as India, which of course we know is also, and we know the dairy industry is one of the biggest employers of women in industry. But what Australia does particularly well in the dairy industry is get far greater output and productivity per cow. And we know that India currently has India gets from its cows about 3/4 of the world standard in terms of productivity. So one of the great reciprocal ways in which the Australian dairy industry could assist India is not necessarily only by selling product into the market, if that were to be allowed, and I know it is, but also by working with the sector to promote the ways in which in Australia the dairy industry has upped productivity to increase output and to increase value. And that would be a great outcome for India. Secondly, we know that pulses can be short here at times. And as the article commented, and I know Matt Canavan, who's no longer a minister, but he'd be delighted by this, if Indian investors invested in arable land, particularly in Northern Australia, they could not only increase the sale of pulses into India, but do so in the other season, because of course we're a Southern Hemisphere country, and we're growing pulses in your winter and vice versa. So there are many ways in which we get reciprocity out of the trade relationship, which will benefit us both. But you know, I just make this point always that Australia is a population of 25.5 million people. We can feed 60 million people. Our agricultural products are never going to swamp the Indian market of 1.3 billion people. And I think India needs to be less fearful of that and more open as to how Australia can assist it to increase the productivity in its agricultural industries.
That's a very valid observation, High Commissioner. We have a question from Waqas Khan. He asks you, how is Australia foreseeing to balance its relations between its strongest economic partners, China and India, while China and India have strong disputes along their border? So how is Australia going to balance its two economic partners when they face off on the Himalayas and in the Indo-Pacific eventually?
So I repeat again, Samir, what I think is a fact, which is that we have traded since we became a nation, which was, we federated in 1901, but we were a trading nation before that. We traded with India before that. We have invited people into our country from all around the world. We're one of the most multicultural communities globally. We will continue to be a free, open trading society until the end of time. But just because we're trading with one or another, doesn't mean that we get caught up in other people's disputes. And as I said before, we enter into relationships, whether multilateral or bilaterally, with our own interests, seeking to cooperate with like-minded countries, particularly like-minded democracies, to achieve the outcomes that we want. And it is much easier achieving outcomes with like-minded democracies in some other countries, and we'll continue to do that as well.
We move into the last 10 minutes, High Commissioner. This is from an anonymous attendee. That's the title of the person who has posted this question, but clearly concerned anonymous attendee. The question is Australia planning to allow international students to join in August 2020?
To join?
To join universities, to go to Australia.
Oh, sorry. I know that the university sector in Australia is looking hard at ways in which to provide a pathway to education in second semester or the first semester next year. That's being currently worked on. I can't announce that, but we are very keen to provide support to Indian students in Australia, as is happening now, and to provide support to those Indian students who are wanting to come to Australia. And no one's keener than me to see a resumption in that traffic. But of course, what we know is we now live in a world where COVID is rife. Until such time as there is a vaccine, I think it's hard to see how international travel will return to what it was pre-January of this year. But I do know that the Australian government, the university sector, are deep in discussions on what can be done to ensure that Australia's reputation as a place of quality education can continue to be offered to students from overseas.
High Commissioner, we have a number of questions on the importance of the Quad post-COVID, the Indo-Pacific partnerships. I'm going to take one of the questions, which is kind of representative of a cluster of similar queries. It's by Ash, and he asks you, how does the High Commissioner perceive intensifying cooperation amongst the Indo-Pacific countries? And his review of Rory Metcalf's book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future.
So because I'm here, because we've had a lockdown, I haven't read the book yet, but I was fascinated by my friend Navdeep Suri's brief mention of it recently in a podcast. So I apologise to Rory. I have one ordered, but it hasn't arrived yet. The thing about the Quad is that the Quad is an incredibly important and proving to be an incredibly important forum for like-minded democracies to deal with key issues like cybersecurity, counter-terrorism and maritime security. And those issues are issues that are important today and were important before COVID. And I see that they'll only be more important beyond COVID. And, as I said before, Australia and India in particular share the Indo-Pacific. Australia and India, as like-minded democracies, have a commitment to rules and norms, free and open societies characterising the Indo-Pacific, not raw politics or authoritarianism. And I think that, along with ensuring free trade, not just across the Indo-Pacific, but I think through the South China Sea and others, are maintained, are going to be incredibly important because, as I said before, we're going to see a migration of power and wealth from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. And the most important of those, because of the opportunities it provides for citizens in all of our countries, is the economic. We're going to have 5 of the leading world economies, top economies in this region in the next decade. And for that reason, we need to strengthen the security and stability of the Indo-Pacific. That was Prime Minister Modi's message when he talked about the Indo-Pacific. It's something that Australia signed up to, and it's something that I think we'll be working strongly together with in the post-COVID world.
I have to say hello to you from another Raisina young fellow, Amelia Long. She's a policy officer in DFAT, and she is currently in Australia, but on her way to, I think, Indonesia. And she was our 2020 young fellow. I promised her that I'll say hello to you from her side.
And she should forget Indonesia, come to India.
Excellent, I'll tell her that. I think she'll be thrilled. I have a question from Ritu David. She says, Ambassador, we have 300,000 Australian educated folks living in this country, in India. These are folks who have graduated from Australian universities. How does the High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell see this group shaping geopolitical trade and soft ties between our nations?
The Australian alumni in Australia, in India, is indeed our greatest asset. Whether Kiran Mazumdar Shaw or the humblest master's degree awardee in this country, because they do more to strengthen the relationship than business deals will ever do. Because they promote understanding at a local level, they inevitably end up in roles in business, in politics, in government, in sport and the like, that strengthen each of the relationships in those areas. So I know that in the 10 years in which I've been coming to India, the visibility and the engagement of the High Commission here in New Delhi and our consulate generals in Chennai, in Mumbai and Calcutta have increasingly been around the alumni that live in their patches because of their importance. So when I first came to India 10 years ago, Samir, some of our leading universities in Australia had no visibility about their alumni in India. Each of them now often has an officer here, including my friend Amit Dasgupta, who does a good job for the University of New South Wales. They keep a close track on their alumni, what they're up to, where they're working, try to keep them involved with the university, and it's a great resource for them, and it's a great national resource for Australia.
High Commissioner, there's also an offer from Arijit Banerjee. He first asks you what have been the challenges in repatriating Australian nationals back home, and can we assist you in bridging the gap through the youth dialogue members and alumni based here?
So the Australia-India Youth Dialogue is a very strong piece of the Australia-India bilateral architecture, and I'm a great supporter of it, and I'm about to do a favour for the Australia-India Youth Dialogue by doing a WebEx or a Zoom or whatever we're going to call it, but that will be terrific. I'm happy to support those entities. Look, the challenge initially, Samir, was that when the lockdown occurred, it's clear that Australia is a long way from India, particularly without the ability to transit. As we know, people previously either travelled to India directly with Air India or through the Middle East, or more likely through Singapore. A lot of those transiting routes were ended. Some of the airlines we initially approached were concerned about the long hop, were concerned about the impact because of that long flight on their staff when they didn't have relief staff at the other end to fly home. So it took us a while to get going, but I'm pleased to say that as we sit here today, we've had 15 flights returning 4,200 Australians from 4 cities in India to 6 cities in Australia. We've got more Qantas flights out on the 19th and 20th of May from Chennai and from Mumbai. And of course, Air India announced yesterday, perhaps a bit prematurely, that on the 21st of May, they're going to be flying 7 flights to Australia to evacuate Indians in Australia who were stranded there back to India, 3 into Sydney and 4 into Melbourne.
I think that also, in some sense, responds to Gloria Palumi Singh's question, so I will skip that one. We are about to reach the end of our time, but let me ask you 2 questions. The first is based on a cluster of questions around RCEP. How hopeful are you of India joining the RCEP? And the second, if you and I were to be having this question 5 years from now, what would be those 4 or 3 or 4 areas of achievements that we would be discussing in the India-Australia bilateral?
So firstly, with RCEP, a matter for the Indian government, obviously, but it knows the door is still open because the agreement's not due to be finalised till the last quarter of this year. But I've said before, and I'm happy to say again today because I believe it, that if India did want to rejoin, there could be no better time than now, because it would send a signal to the world that not only was India an attractive place to invest, but also that its potential of being a global manufacturing hub, as envisaged by the government of India's Make in India policy, was realisable. At a time when companies around the world are looking at diversifying their production bases, the decision to sign up to RCEP would send the best possible signal. In 5 years' time, Samir, I'd like to see the India economic strategy that the government of Australia responded to 18 months ago come to fruition. And that's about a significant increase in two-way investment between our countries, particularly between Australia and India in both directions. Secondly, that we see a further deepening of the relationship. Thirdly, that we further strengthen and deepen what is the perhaps hidden gem of the Australia-India relationship, and that is our defence relationship, which has seen a 6-fold increase in activities over a quadrupling of activities over the past 6 years, which is just extraordinary and often gets missed in all the obsessions in pointing to Malabar. What gets missed is the rest of the deepness of that relationship. For me, I want to see, particularly for those from universities who are watching, not only a restoration of the usual business as normal for university students who come from India to Australia, but a significant increase in those numbers. But ultimately, I will look back on the 3 and a bit years that I spent here, Samir, with pride, if I see that what I believe is a strong alignment between Australia and India going forward has indeed been cemented, and that we no longer talk about converged interests. We no longer talk about, well, Australia's not really committed to the Quad and these sorts of things. That there's a definite understanding that as like-minded democracies who share the same sorts of liberal principles as those who set up the post-world order put in place to ensure free and open societies where citizens have opportunities to exceed on the basis of their worth and how hard they work, and not on whose ear they have or in authoritarian regimes.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, this early evening, High Commissioner Farrell. Let me confirm to you that at ORF, we see Australia as a very exciting partner. We are currently engaged with the Lowy Institute, the Perth Asia Centre, ANU, and ASPI. And with a few of them, we have ongoing research projects, and with others, we convene digitally these days. But we continue to deepen our relationship and our engagement with the academia and think tanks in your country. And we look forward to receiving you at ORF in better days. So stay safe, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. And let me thank all the viewers and audience for all their questions. My apologies that there are still possibly 25 odd queries I could not post to you, but we'll have him back soon. Thank you so much, High Commissioner.
Thanks, Samir.
Thank you.